You are worthless and pathetic. Pack your bags and get out of my house immediately, she screamed at me. I simply smiled and said, try to make me. When she called the police and showed them the lease agreement, they had to tell her the shocking truth that would change everything forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the gauze curtains of my modest bedroom on the third floor of the Riverside Gardens apartment complex, casting gentle shadows across the walls I had painted myself in soft lavender 3 years earlier. My name is Elena Rodriguez, and at 35 I had learned that life rarely unfolds according to the plans we make in our 20s. As I sat at my small wooden desk, reviewing architectural blueprints spread across its surface, I reflected on the winding path that had brought me to this moment of quiet determination and hidden strength. Most people who encountered me in my daily life saw a soft-spoken woman who worked as a property manager for a mid-sized real estate development company downtown. They observed someone who dressed conservatively, spoke politely to everyone she met, and seemed to live a predictable, unremarkable existence. What they could not see was the ambitious vision that had been quietly growing in my mind for the better part of a decade, or the strategic financial planning that had enabled me to transform modest savings into substantial real estate investments. The Riverside Gardens complex where I lived consisted of 4 buildings housing a total of 68 apartment units, surrounded by carefully maintained gardens and a small community center that hosted evening classes and weekend events for residents. The property occupied an entire city block in the emerging East Bridge district, an area that city planners had designated for significant redevelopment over the next 15 years. What made this location particularly valuable was its proximity to the new metro expansion project and the planned technology corridor that would bring thousands of high-paying jobs to the neighborhood within the next 5 years. 3 years earlier, I had made what many of my colleagues considered an impulsive and financially risky decision. When the previous owner of Riverside Gardens decided to sell the property due to health concerns and family obligations, I had submitted an offer that exhausted my savings and required me to secure a substantial mortgage. The purchase price of $2.8 million represented every penny I had accumulated through years of careful budgeting, strategic investing in the stock market, and the modest inheritance I had received from my grandmother's estate. The decision to buy Riverside Gardens had been driven by more than simple investment calculations, although the financial projections were certainly compelling. The property generated consistent rental income from long-term tenants who appreciated the quiet, well-maintained environment and reasonable rent prices. The location offered excellent potential for appreciation as the surrounding neighborhood continued to develop. Most importantly, owning this property provided me with a level of financial security and independence that I had never experienced before in my life. My path to real estate ownership had begun during my college years when I studied business administration with a focus on finance and real estate development. Unlike many of my classmates who were primarily interested in corporate careers or entrepreneurial ventures, I had become fascinated by the long-term wealth-building potential of real estate investment. I spent countless hours in the library reading books about property investment strategies, studying market trends, and learning about the legal and financial aspects of real estate ownership. After graduation, I had deliberately chosen to work in property management rather than pursuing higher-paying positions in other industries. This decision puzzled many of my friends and family members, who could not understand why someone with my education and capabilities would choose a career path that appeared to offer limited advancement opportunity. What they failed to recognize was that working in property management provided me with invaluable practical education about real estate operations, market dynamics, and investment opportunities that no classroom could have offered. Over the 7 years I worked for various property management companies before purchasing Riverside Gardens, I had absorbed every detail about effective property operation. I learned how to evaluate properties for investment potential, how to manage tenant relationships effectively, how to maintain buildings efficiently, and how to identify opportunities for value enhancement through strategic improvement. More importantly, I developed an understanding of the real estate market that enabled me to recognize undervalued properties and predict neighborhood development patterns. During those years of learning and preparation, I had lived extremely frugally, directing every possible dollar toward savings and investment. While my colleagues spent their weekends shopping or dining at expensive restaurants, I spent my free time researching investment opportunities and studying market trends. While others purchased new cars and expensive electronics, I continued driving my reliable used Honda and furnished my apartment with carefully selected second-hand pieces that I refinished myself. The sacrifice had been significant, but it had also been purposeful. Every financial decision I made was evaluated against my long-term goal of achieving real estate ownership and the financial independence that would accompany it. I understood that building wealth required delayed gratification and strategic thinking rather than immediate consumption and emotional spending. When the opportunity to purchase Riverside Gardens presented itself, I was prepared not only financially but also operationally. I had spent months analyzing the property's income potential, evaluating necessary maintenance and improvement projects, and developing a comprehensive management plan that would maximize both tenant satisfaction and investment return. The decision to buy the property was based on careful analysis rather than emotional impulse, although I would be lying if I said there was not an element of excitement about finally achieving my goal of property ownership. The 3 years since purchasing Riverside Gardens had validated my investment thesis. The property's rental income covered the mortgage payments, maintenance costs, and property taxes, while providing a modest positive cash flow that I reinvested in property improvements and my personal savings. The value of the property had appreciated by approximately 12% annually as the surrounding neighborhood continued to develop and attract new residents and businesses. More importantly, owning Riverside Gardens had provided me with a sense of accomplishment and security that extended far beyond the financial benefits. I had successfully transitioned from employee to business owner, from tenant to landlord, from someone who paid rent to someone who collected it. The transformation had been gradual and largely invisible to casual observers, but it represented a fundamental shift in my financial position and personal confidence. My tenants knew me as Elena, the friendly and responsive property manager who handled maintenance requests promptly and treated everyone with respect and consideration. They appreciated my approachable demeanor and my commitment to maintaining the property at high standards. What they did not know was that their monthly rent payments were actually going directly to me as the property owner, rather than to some distant investment company or absentee landlord. I had deliberately chosen to maintain this arrangement for several practical reasons. Managing the property myself allowed me to maintain close relationships with tenants and respond quickly to any issues that arose. It also enabled me to keep operating costs low by avoiding the expense of hiring an external management company. Most importantly, it allowed me to maintain privacy about my financial position and avoid potential complications that might arise if tenants knew they were paying rent directly to someone who lived in the same building. The decision to live in one of the apartments rather than maintaining a separate residence had been both practical and strategic. The apartment provided comfortable living space, while allowing me to monitor the property closely and maintain strong relationships with tenants. Living on site also reduced my personal housing costs, freeing up additional income for property improvements and personal savings. My daily routine reflected the dual nature of my role as both resident and property owner. Each morning, I would begin my day by walking through the common areas and around the exterior of the buildings, checking for any maintenance issues that needed attention and ensuring that the landscaping and general appearance met my standards. I would then review any tenant communications that had arrived overnight and prioritize any work orders or requests that required immediate attention. After completing my property management duties, I would commute to my position with Morrison & Associates Real Estate Development, where I managed a portfolio of commercial properties for institutional investors. The irony of managing other people's real estate investments while secretly owning a significant property myself was not lost on me, but it also provided valuable perspective on different approaches to property ownership and management. My colleagues at Morrison & Associates knew me as a dedicated and knowledgeable professional who approached her work with thoroughness and attention to detail. They respected my analytical capabilities and often sought my input on complex property evaluation projects. What they did not know was that my insights into real estate investment were informed by my personal experience as a property owner, rather than purely theoretical knowledge gained through education and employment. The contrast between my public persona and my private reality had become a source of quiet satisfaction and growing confidence. I had successfully achieved a level of financial independence that most people my age could only aspire to, but I had done so without fanfare or recognition from others. The accomplishment felt more meaningful because it had been achieved through my own efforts and strategic thinking, rather than through external validation or assistance. My family relationships had always been complicated, and my real estate success had added another layer of complexity to those dynamics. My younger brother Miguel had always been the family favorite, blessed with natural charisma and social confidence that seemed to open doors effortlessly throughout his life. While I had focused on education and career development, Miguel had concentrated on networking and relationship building, pursuing opportunities in sales and marketing that rewarded his interpersonal skill. Miguel's career in pharmaceutical sales had provided him with a comfortable income and an active social life, but it had not taught him the financial discipline and long-term planning skills that had enabled my real estate investment. He lived comfortably but paycheck to paycheck, spending his income on entertainment, travel and consumer goods, rather than building wealth for the future. 6 months earlier, Miguel had announced his engagement to Vanessa Montenegro, a 28-year-old marketing coordinator who worked for a luxury fashion brand downtown. Vanessa was undeniably beautiful and socially accomplished, with an extensive network of friends and colleagues who moved in the city's more fashionable circle. She possessed the kind of confident, outgoing personality that commanded attention in social situations and made her the center of conversations at parties and gatherings. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. From my first meeting with Vanessa, I had sensed that she viewed me with a mixture of confusion and mild disdain. My quiet demeanor and modest lifestyle clearly puzzled her, and she seemed unable to understand how Miguel and I could be related, given our vastly different approaches to life and social interaction. During family gatherings, Vanessa would make subtle comments about my career choices and living situation that were technically polite, but carried undertones of condescension. The wedding had been an elaborate affair that had strained Miguel's finances significantly, requiring him to take on additional debt to fund the reception, honeymoon and other expenses that Vanessa considered essential for their special day. I had attended the celebration and wished them well sincerely, despite my private concerns about their financial planning and long-term compatibility. Following their marriage, Miguel and Vanessa had moved into a luxury apartment in the trendy downtown district, signing a lease that consumed nearly 40% of Miguel's monthly income. The apartment featured high-end finishes and amenities that photographed beautifully for Vanessa's social media accounts, but the financial strain of the rent payments had begun affecting their relationship within the first few months of marriage. 3 weeks ago, Miguel had called me with a request that I should have anticipated but that still caught me somewhat off guard. He explained that he and Vanessa were struggling with their current rent payments and wondered if they could temporarily move into my apartment at Riverside Gardens, while they saved money for a house down payment. The request was presented as a short-term solution that would benefit everyone involved, allowing them to reduce their housing costs while providing me with companionship and assistance with property management duties. My initial reaction had been to decline the request diplomatically, explaining that my one-bedroom apartment was not suitable for 3 people and suggesting alternative solutions that might address their financial concerns. However, Miguel had persisted, and our parents had become involved in the conversation, presenting the situation as an opportunity for me to help my brother during a difficult period, while strengthening our family relationship. The pressure to accommodate Miguel and Vanessa had been subtle but persistent, playing on themes of family loyalty and mutual support that were difficult to argue against without appearing selfish or unsympathetic. Eventually, I had agreed to allow them to stay in my apartment temporarily, with the understanding that the arrangement would last no more than 3 months, and that they would contribute to household expenses while looking actively for alternative housing. The decision to agree to this arrangement had been motivated partly by family obligation and partly by curiosity about how the situation would develop. I had been intrigued by the prospect of observing Vanessa's reaction to the modest living environment at Riverside Gardens, particularly given her apparent preference for luxury and status symbol. I had also been interested in seeing how Miguel and Vanessa would handle the financial discipline required to save money for a house down payment, when they had previously demonstrated little capacity for budgeting or long-term financial planning. As I prepared for Miguel and Vanessa's arrival the following week, I reflected on the delicate balance I would need to maintain between being a supportive family member and protecting my own interests and privacy. They would be living in my apartment and interacting with my tenants, but they would not know that I owned the entire property and collected rent from everyone in the building. The situation presented both risks and opportunities that I would need to navigate carefully. On one hand, having them in my living space would compromise my privacy and potentially create complications in my relationships with tenants and my property management responsibility. On the other hand, the arrangement might provide valuable insights into their character and priorities that could inform my future interactions with them and my approach to family relationships generally. Most importantly, I was curious to see how Vanessa would react to living in an environment that was comfortable but not luxurious, surrounded by working-class tenants rather than the fashionable professionals she preferred to associate with in her social life. The next few months would reveal whether her apparent materialism and status consciousness were surface-level preferences or deeper character traits that would create ongoing challenges for her marriage to my brother. As the morning sun climbed higher and began warming my apartment, I gathered the architectural blueprints from my desk and prepared to begin another day of managing both my public role as a property management professional and my private identity as a real estate investor and property owner. The foundation of my transformation was complete, and the next chapter of my story was about to begin. Little did I know that the arrival of Miguel and Vanessa would set in motion a series of events that would test everything I had learned about human nature, family dynamics, and the true meaning of strength and dignity under pressure. The morning of Miguel and Vanessa's arrival dawned crisp and clear, with autumn sunlight streaming through the maple trees that lined the entrance to Riverside Garden. I had spent the previous evening preparing my apartment for their temporary residence, rearranging furniture to accommodate 3 people in a space designed for one and clearing closet space for their belongings. The physical preparations had been straightforward, but the emotional preparation for sharing my sanctuary with 2 people whose lifestyle priorities differed dramatically from my own required considerably more effort. At precisely 10 o'clock, I heard the rumble of a moving truck turning into the parking area behind buildings. Through my kitchen window, I watched as Miguel emerged from the passenger seat of a large rental truck, followed immediately by Vanessa, who stepped carefully onto the asphalt in designer heels that were clearly inappropriate for moving day activity. Even from 3 floors above, I could observe Vanessa's facial expression as she surveyed her new temporary surroundings, and the disappointment was evident in her posture and the way she crossed her arms defensively across her chest. I made my way downstairs to greet them and assist with the moving process, carrying the spare apartment keys I had prepared along with a welcome basket containing fresh coffee, homemade muffins, and a brief orientation guide I had created that explained the building's amenities and community guidelines. As I approached the truck, I could hear Vanessa speaking to Miguel in a tone that carried clearly across the parking area despite her apparent attempt at discretion. "This place looks like subsidized housing," she was saying, gesturing broadly at the modest brick buildings, with their practical but unremarkable architecture. "How long did you say we would be staying here? Because I really do not think I can handle this environment for very long. My friends are going to think we have completely lost our minds." Miguel spotted me approaching and immediately shifted to a more positive demeanor, though I could see the stress lines around his eyes that suggested the conversation I had overheard was not an isolated incident. "Alina, "Thank you so much for letting us stay here," he said, embracing me warmly. "We really appreciate you helping us out during this transition period." Vanessa's greeting was considerably more restrained, consisting of a brief hug that felt more like a social obligation than genuine affection, followed by a quick survey of my appearance that took in my practical jeans, comfortable sneakers, and simple cotton sweater. I could almost see her mental calculations as she assessed my modest presentation and wondered how someone who dressed so simply could afford to live independently while she and Miguel struggled with their luxury apartment rent. "Thank you for this opportunity," Vanessa said with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "We promise we will not be here very long, just until we can find something more suitable for our needs and save up for a proper down payment on a house in a better neighborhood." The phrase "better neighborhood" hung in the air with particular emphasis, and I noticed Mrs. Chen, one of my long-term tenants from Building A, pause in her garden work to glance in our direction. Miss Chen had lived at Riverside Gardens for 8 years and took considerable pride in the community we had built together. I made a mental note to speak with her later to address any concerns she might have about the new temporary resident. The moving process revealed additional insights into Miguel and Vanessa's financial situation and lifestyle priorities. The rental truck was packed with an extraordinary amount of possessions for two people who claimed to be downsizing and saving money. Designer furniture, expensive electronics, and numerous boxes labeled with the names of luxury clothing brands filled the truck from floor to ceiling. As we began unloading their belongings, I realized that my modest one-bedroom apartment would struggle to accommodate even a fraction of what they had brought with them. "Where exactly do you expect us to put all of this?" Vanessa asked, standing in my living room and surveying the available space with obvious dismay. "This apartment is smaller than our walk-in closet in the downtown place. There is literally nowhere to put our things." Miguel attempted to mediate the situation by suggesting that they could store some items in the building's basement storage area, but Vanessa's response made it clear that she considered any form of storage solution to be unacceptable. "I am not putting my designer handbags and shoes in some damp basement where they could be damaged," she declared. "These things cost more money than most people make in a month. They require proper climate-controlled storage." I found myself in the awkward position of trying to accommodate guests who seemed determined to be dissatisfied with every aspect of their temporary living situation. Rather than expressing gratitude for the opportunity to reduce their housing costs and save money, Vanessa appeared to view the arrangement as a significant hardship that she was enduring with great personal sacrifice. The unpacking process continued throughout the afternoon, with Vanessa providing a running commentary on every aspect of the apartment that failed to meet her standards. The kitchen was too small to prepare proper meals. The bathroom lacked adequate counter space for her extensive collection of beauty products. The bedroom closet could not accommodate her wardrobe without significant reorganization and compression. The living room furniture was outdated and uncomfortable compared to the contemporary pieces they had purchased for their downtown apartment. What struck me most profoundly during this process was Vanessa's complete inability to recognize the quality and thoughtfulness that had gone into creating a comfortable, functional living space within modest means. The apartment featured hardwood floors that I had refinished myself, custom-built storage solutions that maximized the available space, and carefully selected furnishings that prioritized durability and comfort over fashion trends. Every element of the apartment reflected deliberate choices made to create a peaceful, efficient environment that supported my goals and lifestyle. Vanessa saw none of these qualities. Instead, she focused exclusively on what the apartment lacked compared to the luxury accommodations she preferred. Her complaints revealed a fundamental inability to appreciate value that was not immediately visible or socially impressive. More concerning was her assumption that her dissatisfaction was shared by Miguel and that I would naturally understand and sympathize with her disappointment. "I suppose this is fine for someone who does not entertain very often," she said while examining my modest dining area. "But we are used to hosting dinner parties and having friends over regularly. This space is just not suitable for the kind of social life we are accustomed to maintain." Miguel's discomfort with Vanessa's critical commentary was becoming increasingly obvious as the day progressed. He attempted to redirect her attention toward the positive aspects of their temporary situation, pointing out the peaceful surroundings, the convenient location,
and the opportunity to save money for their future home purchase. However, Vanessa seemed determined to focus on every perceived shortcoming and to ensure that everyone present understood her dissatisfaction with the arrangement. By early evening, we had managed to unpack their essential belongings and establish a functional if crowded living arrangement. I had prepared a simple dinner of pasta with homemade marinara sauce, fresh bread, and salad, thinking that a home-cooked meal would help them feel welcome and settled. The dinner conversation provided additional insights into their financial situation and future plans that were both illuminating and concerning. Vanessa spent considerable time discussing her career and marketing for luxury fashion brands, emphasizing the importance of maintaining certain standards of appearance and lifestyle in order to succeed in her industry. According to her explanation, living in a modest apartment in an unfashionable neighborhood could potentially damage her professional reputation and limit her advancement opportunities. "Image is everything in my business," she explained while picking at her pasta with obvious lack of enthusiasm. "My clients and colleagues expect me to embody the lifestyle that our brands represent. If they see me living in a place like this, they might question my understanding of luxury and sophistication." I found this reasoning both fascinating and troubling. Vanessa appeared to believe that her professional success depended on maintaining an expensive lifestyle that exceeded her financial means, creating a cycle of financial stress that prevented her from building long-term wealth or security. She had confused consumption with competence and appearance with achievement. Miguel's perspective on their financial situation was somewhat more realistic, though still concerning in its lack of concrete planning or measurable goals. He spoke vaguely about saving money for a house down payment, while continuing to spend freely on entertainment, dining out, and consumer goods. When I asked specific questions about their savings targets and timeline, both Miguel and Vanessa became evasive and changed the subject to other topics. The evening concluded with Vanessa retiring early, claiming exhaustion from the moving process, while Miguel and I cleaned up the dinner dishes and had a brief private conversation about their plans and expectations. Miguel expressed gratitude for my assistance and assured me that they would be respectful guests who would not interfere with my routines or create problems with other residents. "I know Vanessa seems a little overwhelmed right now," Miguel said with characteristic diplomacy. "She just needs time to adjust to the change in environment. Once she settles in and starts saving money, I think she will appreciate what you are doing for." I nodded politely while privately doubting that Vanessa possessed the capacity for the kind of perspective shift that Miguel was describing. Her behavior throughout the day had revealed someone who viewed the world primarily through the lens of her own comfort and convenience, with little apparent consideration for other perspectives or circumstances. The following morning brought my first real glimpse of how Miguel and Vanessa's presence would affect my daily routines and my relationships with other tenants. I woke at my usual time to begin my morning property inspection rounds, only to discover that Vanessa was already in the kitchen, loudly complaining about the coffee maker while speaking on her phone with someone who appeared to be receiving a detailed description of her disappointing new living situation. "You should see this place," Vanessa was saying in a voice that carried clearly throughout the apartment. "It is like something out of the 1990s. The appliances are ancient, the decor is completely outdated, and the neighborhood is full of working-class people who probably think Starbucks is fancy. I honestly do not know how I am going to survive here for 3 months." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Vanessa providing increasingly dramatic descriptions of her temporary living conditions and expressing elaborate sympathy for her own situation. When she finally ended the call and noticed my presence in the kitchen, she offered a perfunctory apology that was clearly intended to minimize any offense rather than express genuine remorse. "I was just updating my sister about our new living arrangement," she explained with a dismissive shrug.
She was asking how we are settling in, so I was giving her an honest assessment of the situation. I prepared my coffee and gathered my things for the day without responding to Vanessa's explanation, but the incident had provided valuable insight into her character and her likely behavior during their stay. Vanessa appeared to view herself as the victim of unfortunate circumstances rather than the beneficiary of generous assistance, and she seemed determined to ensure that everyone in her social circle understood her dissatisfaction with the arrangement. During my morning property inspection, I encountered several tenants who had either heard Vanessa's loud phone conversation or observed the moving activities from the previous day. Mrs. Chain approached me with diplomatic concern about the new temporary residents, expressing hope that they would respect the quiet, respect-for atmosphere that characterized our community. "We have always appreciated how peaceful and considerate everyone is here," Mrs. Chen said carefully. "I hope your brother and his wife will understand our community standards and help maintain the environment we have all worked to create together." I assured Ms. Chen that I would address any issues that arose and reminded her that Miguel and Vanessa were temporary residents who would be moving on to permanent housing within a few months. However, the conversation highlighted my growing concern about the potential impact of their presence on the community dynamics that I had worked carefully to cultivate over the past 3 years. The rest of the first week followed a similar pattern, with Vanessa's dissatisfaction becoming increasingly vocal and her behavior becoming more disruptive to the building's peaceful atmosphere. She complained loudly about everything from the water pressure in the shower to the noise level from neighboring apartments to the lack of convenient parking spaces near the building entrance. More concerning was Vanessa's apparent assumption that her temporary residence at Riverside Gardens entitled her to special treatment and accommodations that were not available to other residents. She requested that I arrange for assigned parking spaces closer to the building entrance, demanded that I adjust the building's quiet hours to accommodate her preferred schedule, and suggested that I install additional security features that would make her feel more comfortable in the neighborhood. Each of these requests revealed Vanessa's fundamental misunderstanding of her position as a temporary guest rather than a permanent resident with equal standing in the community. More troubling was her apparent expectation that I would prioritize her comfort and preferences over the needs and established routines of long-term tenants who had been part of the Riverside Gardens community for years. Miguel's response to Vanessa's escalating demands was to apologize repeatedly for her behavior while avoiding any direct confrontation about her unrealistic expectations or disrespectful treatment of me and other residents. His conflict avoidance strategy was understandable but ineffective, allowing Vanessa's sense of entitlement to grow rather than addressing the underlying issues that were creating tension within the community. By the end of their first week at Riverside Gardens, I had begun to realize that the next few months would test not only my patience and diplomatic skills, but also my ability to protect the community I had worked so hard to build while maintaining family relationships that were important to me despite their complications. The foundation had been established for what was likely to become an increasingly difficult situation. Vanessa's character had been revealed through her initial reactions and behavior, and her pattern of escalating demands and complaints suggested that the real challenges were yet to come. I prepared myself mentally for the tests ahead, drawing on the same strategic thinking and quiet determination that had enabled my real estate success to navigate the complex dynamics that were developing in my own home. The second week of Miguel and Vanessa's residence at Riverside Gardens marked a significant shift in the dynamics of our shared living arrangement. Where the first week had been characterized by Vanessa's complaints and general dissatisfaction, the second week brought a new level of assertiveness that bordered on presumption. Vanessa had apparently moved beyond merely expressing her disappointment with the accommodations to actively attempting to reshape the environment according to her preferences and expectations. The transformation in Vanessa's behavior became evident on Monday morning when I discovered her in the building's community laundry room, engaged in a heated conversation with Mr. Thompson, an elderly gentleman who had been a reliable tenant for over 6 years. Mr. Thompson was explaining the established schedule that residents use to share the washing machines fairly, while Vanessa was insisting that her needs should take priority due to what she described as her more demanding professional requirement. "I work in fashion marketing," Vanessa was explaining with barely controlled impatience. "My clothing requires special care and specific washing schedules that cannot be accommodated by some arbitrary system designed for people who do not understand quality garments. I need access to these machines when it is convenient for my schedule, not when other people decide it is their turn." Mr. Thompson, who had been listening with admirable patience, attempted to explain that the informal scheduling system had worked successfully for years precisely because it considered everyone's needs equal. His reasonable tone only seemed to increase Vanessa's frustration, and her response revealed a fundamental inability to grasp the concept of shared community resources. Look, I appreciate that you have your little system here, Vanessa continued, but I am only going to be here temporarily, and I need accommodations that work for my situation. Surely you can understand that some people have more pressing needs than others. I intervened before the conversation could escalate further, apologizing to Mr. Thompson for the misunderstanding and explaining to Vanessa that all residents, regardless of their length of stay, were expected to respect the community guidelines that helped maintain harmony among neighbors. Vanessa's response to my gentle correction was revealing in its complete lack of awareness about appropriate boundaries. Elena, you need to understand that Miguel and I have different standards and requirements than most of the people living here, she said with the kind of condescending tone typically reserved for explaining obvious concepts to children. We are professionals with demanding careers and sophisticated lifestyles. The rules that work for everyone else simply do not apply to our situation. Thompson represented the beginning of what would become a pattern of increasingly bold attempts by Vanessa to establish herself as somehow exempt from the normal expectations of community living. Over the following days, she would approach various tenants with requests for special accommodations, schedule changes, and priority access to shared amenities that revealed her growing sense of entitlement and her complete inability to understand why her requests were inappropriate. Miss Patterson, who lived in the apartment directly below mine, was approached by Vanessa with a request to modify her television viewing schedule because the sound interfered with Vanessa's preferred meditation and yoga routine. Patterson politely explained that she had been watching her evening programs at the same time for 3 years, and that the building's soundproofing should prevent any disturbance. Vanessa suggested that perhaps Mrs. Patterson could use headphones or move her television to a different room. The audacity of requesting that a long-term resident modify her established routines to accommodate a temporary guest was breathtaking, but Vanessa seemed genuinely surprised when Mrs. Patterson declined to make the suggested changes. The rejection prompted Vanessa to seek me out with complaints about the building's noise policies and demands that I intervene to resolve the situation in her favor. I cannot believe you allow tenants to watch television at such high volumes, Vanessa complained during what was becoming a daily session of grievances and demands. In our downtown apartment, the building management would never permit this kind of disturbance. You really need to establish better policies about noise control and consideration for other residents. The irony of Vanessa complaining about consideration for other residents, while simultaneously demanding special treatment for herself, was apparently lost on her entirely. When I explained that Mrs. Patterson's television volume was well within normal limits, and that her viewing schedule was established long before Vanessa's arrival, Vanessa's response revealed the depth of her self-centered worldview. But I am here now, she said with the kind of logic that suggested she believed her presence automatically altered existing arrangements. Surely the current residents should be willing to make small adjustments to help ensure that everyone is comfortable. It is just common courtesy. The concept of common courtesy, as understood by Vanessa, appeared to be entirely unidirectional. She expected consideration and accommodation from others, while showing no reciprocal awareness of how her demands and behavior affected the people around her. More troubling was her apparent belief that I shared her perspective and would naturally support her requests for special treatment. The third week brought an escalation in both the frequency and the audacity of Vanessa's demand. Having exhausted her attempts to modify the behavior of individual tenants, she began approaching me with suggestions for building-wide policy changes that would address what she characterized as systemic problems with the property management and community standard. Her first major proposal involved restructuring the building's visitor parking policies to ensure that she and Miguel would have guaranteed access to the most convenient spaces near the building entrance. According to Vanessa's analysis, the current first-come, first-served system was inefficient and failed to consider the varying importance of different residents' transportation needs. Miguel and I both drive luxury vehicles that require more careful parking than the average car, Vanessa explained with the earnest tone of someone presenting a reasonable business proposal. We also have professional obligations that require us to maintain our vehicles in pristine condition. It would make sense to assign the covered parking spaces to residents who actually need them rather than letting anyone park anywhere. When I explained the current parking system had worked successfully for years and that all residents paid the same parking fees regardless of their vehicle type, Vanessa's response revealed her assumption that quality should automatically confer priority. Her suggestion that residents with ordinary cars should park in less convenient locations to accommodate those with superior vehicles demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of fair treatment and community equity. The parking proposal was followed by suggestions for revising the building's quiet hours, implementing dress codes for common areas, establishing priority scheduling for the community room, and creating separate amenity access for what Vanessa described as professional residents versus standard tenants. Each proposal was presented with the same earnest conviction that her ideas represented obvious improvements that any reasonable person would immediately recognize and implement. Most concerning was Vanessa's growing assumption that I would naturally support her suggestions because we were family members. She began framing her proposals as collaborative efforts that would benefit both of us, apparently believing that my role as Miguel's sister obligated me to prioritize their comfort and preferences over the needs of other residents. Since we are family, I know you want Miguel and me to be happy here, she would say when introducing each new demand. These suggestions would really help us feel more comfortable, and I think they would improve the overall quality of the building for everyone. The presumption that family relationships automatically created obligations for special treatment revealed another layer of Vanessa's character that I found deeply troubling. She appeared to believe that personal connections should override professional responsibilities and fair treatment principles, creating a worldview where favoritism and preferential treatment were not only acceptable but expected. Miguel's response to Vanessa's escalating demands and increasingly inappropriate behavior was to retreat further into passive accommodation. Rather than addressing her unrealistic expectations or setting appropriate boundaries, he seemed to hope that the situation would resolve itself through patience and avoidance. When other residents approached him with concerns about Vanessa's behavior, he would apologize profusely while avoiding any commitment to actually modify her conduct. She is just trying to feel comfortable in a new environment, Miguel would explain when pressed about Vanessa's latest unreasonable request. Once she settles in and gets used to the way things work here, I am sure she will adjust her expectations accordingly. Miguel's conflict avoidance strategy was understandable but ultimately counterproductive. By failing to establish appropriate boundaries with Vanessa, he was enabling her sense of entitlement to grow while placing me in the increasingly difficult position of having to refuse her demands and deal with her disappointment and anger when her requests were denied. The situation reached a critical juncture during the fourth week when Vanessa presented what she described as her comprehensive improvement plan for Riverside Garden. She had apparently spent considerable time analyzing what she perceived as deficiencies in the property's management and operations, and she had developed a detailed proposal for addressing these issues through systematic changes to policies, amenities, and resident expectations. The improvement plan included recommendations for upgrading the building's internet infrastructure to support high-speed connections in every unit, installing security cameras in all common areas, replacing the existing laundry equipment with commercial-grade machines, renovating the community room with contemporary furnishings and entertainment systems, implementing keyless entry systems for enhanced security, and establishing a concierge service to assist residents with various needs and requests. Each recommendation was presented with cost estimates and implementation timelines that revealed Vanessa had invested significant effort in developing her proposal. However, the total cost of her suggested improvements exceeded $200,000. And the projected timeline for implementation would require several years of construction and renovation work that would significantly disrupt the peaceful environment that existing residents value. I know this represents a substantial investment, Vanessa acknowledged when presenting her plan, but these improvements would dramatically increase the property's value and rental income potential. You could probably raise rents by 30 to 40% once these upgrades are completed, which would provide excellent return on investment. The suggestion that I should invest hundreds of thousands of dollars to upgrade the property according to Vanessa's preference, then raise rents substantially to recoup the costs, revealed both her complete misunderstanding of my financial situation and her fundamental lack of consideration for the existing residents who had chosen Riverside Gardens specifically because it offered quality housing at reasonable prices. When I explained that the proposed improvements were neither financially feasible nor consistent with the community's values and priorities, Vanessa's response revealed her growing frustration with what she perceived as my resistance to obvious improvements and my failure to recognize the value of her insights and suggestions. "I am trying to help you improve this property and increase your income potential," she said with barely controlled exasperation. Most property managers would be grateful for this kind of detailed analysis and professional consultation. "I cannot understand why you are not more receptive to suggestions that would benefit everyone involved." The implication that I was somehow failing in my professional responsibilities by not implementing her expensive and disruptive suggestions demonstrated Vanessa's complete inability to understand the difference between her personal preferences and objective improvement. More troubling was her apparent belief that her temporary residence at Riverside Gardens entitled her to influence major decisions about the property's management and development. The improvement plan proposal marked the beginning of what would become increasingly direct challenges to my authority and decision-making regarding the property. Vanessa began questioning my management decisions more frequently and more openly, suggesting that her experience in marketing and her understanding of luxury standards qualified her to provide guidance about property management strategy. "You really should consider bringing in a professional consultant to evaluate your management approach," she suggested during one particularly frustrating conversation. "I think an outside perspective might help you identify opportunities for improvement that you have not considered." The patronizing tone and the implicit criticism of my competence were becoming increasingly difficult to tolerate with diplomatic silence. Vanessa's suggestions were not only inappropriate given her position as a temporary guest, but they also revealed a fundamental lack of respect for my knowledge, experience, and authority regarding the property I had successfully managed for 3 years. As the fourth week concluded, I found myself facing a decision about how to address Vanessa's escalating demands and increasingly presumptuous behavior. The diplomatic approach I had maintained thus far was clearly not effective in establishing appropriate boundaries, and Vanessa's sense of entitlement was continuing to grow rather than moderate over time. The situation was also beginning to affect my relationships with long-term tenants who were becoming increasingly frustrated with Vanessa's disruptions and demands. Several residents had approached me with concerns about the changes in the building's atmosphere since Miguel and Vanessa's arrival, and I could sense growing tension that threatened the harmonious community I had worked carefully to cultivate. The foundation had been established for what was becoming an increasingly untenable situation. Vanessa's character had been fully revealed through her escalating demands and presumptuous behavior, and her pattern of entitlement and disrespect suggested that more significant confrontations were inevitable. I prepared myself mentally for the challenges ahead, drawing on the same strategic thinking and quiet determination that had enabled my success in building a thriving residential community while navigating complex interpersonal dynamics. The beginning of the fifth week marked a fundamental shift in Vanessa's approach to her temporary residence at Riverside Gardens, where previous weeks had featured complaints, suggestions, and increasingly bold requests. The fifth week brought something far more concerning: direct assertions of authority that revealed Vanessa's growing belief that she possessed legitimate decision-making power regarding the property and its management. The transformation became apparent on Monday morning when I discovered that Vanessa had taken it upon herself to post notices throughout the building, announcing new policies that she had unilaterally decided to implement. These notices, printed on expensive letterhead that she had apparently created specifically for this purpose, were posted in the lobby, laundry room, community center, and near the mailboxes, ensuring maximum visibility among all residents. The notices announced what Vanessa described as temporary policy adjustments, designed to improve community living standards during the transitional period,
The policies included designated quiet hours that differed significantly from the existing guideline, new procedures for reserving the community room that required advance approval from what she termed building management, restrictions on visitor parking during certain hours, and guidelines for appropriate attire in common areas that reflected her personal standards of professional appearance. Each notice was signed with Vanessa's full name and included the title Interim Community Relations Coordinator, a position that existed nowhere in the building's actual management structure but that apparently represented her self-appointed role as an authority figure within the residential community. The professional presentation of the notices and the authoritative tone of the language suggested that Vanessa had invested considerable effort in creating what she perceived as legitimate policy documentation. My initial reaction to discovering these notices was a mixture of astonishment and growing concern about the escalation in Vanessa's presumptuous behavior. The fact that she had taken unilateral action to implement policies affecting all residents without any consultation or authorizing represented a fundamental breach of appropriate boundaries that could not be addressed through the diplomatic approach I had maintained thus far. Before I could remove the notices and address the situation with Vanessa directly, I began receiving phone calls and visits from concerned residents who were confused and upset about the sudden appearance of new policies that contradicted established community guidelines. Mrs. Yoon was the first to contact me, expressing bewilderment about the notices and concern about the apparent changes in building management. "I do not understand these new rules," Mrs. Chen explained during her visit to my apartment. "Some of them conflict with the guidelines we have followed successfully for years, and others seem designed to restrict activities that have never been problems before. Who authorized these changes and why were residents not consulted about modifications to our community standards?" Ms. Thompson arrived shortly after Mrs. Chen, carrying one of the notices and requesting clarification about the new procedures for using the laundry facility. According to Vanessa's posted guidelines, residents would now be required to reserve specific time slots in advance and would be limited to particular machines, based on what she described as laundry priority categories that seemed to prioritize professional clothing over general household items. "These new rules make no sense," Mr. Thompson said with uncharacteristic frustration. "The current system works perfectly well, and these changes would create unnecessary complications for everyone. Moreover, I have no idea who this interim community relations coordinator person is or what authority she has to implement these policies." The conversation with Ms. Thompson was interrupted by the arrival of 3 more residents, all carrying copies of Vanessa's notices and all seeking explanations about the sudden policy changes. As I attempted to address their concerns and assure them that the notices had been posted without authorization, I could hear Vanessa's voice from the hallway as she engaged another resident in what appeared to be a detailed explanation of her new policy. "These guidelines are designed to bring our community standards up to the level that professionals expect in quality residential environments," Vanessa was explaining to Mrs. Rodriguez from building. "The previous informal arrangements were adequate for a certain type of resident, but as the community evolves to attract more sophisticated tenants, we need policies that reflect higher expectations and standards." The condescending tone and the implicit criticism of existing residents in Vanessa's explanation represented a new level of inappropriateness that demanded immediate intervention. I excused myself from the concerned residents in my apartment and stepped into the hallway to address the situation directly. "Vanessa, I need to speak with you immediately about these notices you have posted throughout the building," I said with a firmness that I had not previously employed in our interactions. "These policies were not authorized by building management, and they need to be removed immediately." Vanessa's response to my direct confrontation revealed the extent to which her sense of authority and entitlement had grown over the previous week. Rather than acknowledging her overreach or apologizing for the confusion she had created, Vanessa defended her actions with the confidence of someone who believed she was acting within her legitimate right. "Elena, I think you are overreacting to what is clearly a positive development for the building," she replied with the patient tone typically used when addressing unreasonable opposition to obvious improvement. "These policies address real issues that have been negatively affecting the quality of life here. As someone with professional experience in managing sophisticated environments, I felt obligated to take action when I saw problems that were not being adequately addressed." the implication that I had been failing in my management responsibilities and that Vanessa's intervention was necessary to address neglected problems represented a direct challenge to my competence and authority that could not be ignored or diplomatically deflected. More concerning was her apparent belief that her temporary residence at Riverside Gardens had somehow granted her legitimate authority to make unilateral decisions affecting all residents. These policies were implemented without any consultation with residents or authorization from property management, I continued, maintaining the firm but professional tone that the situation required. They contradict established community guidelines and create confusion among residents who have been following successful procedures for years. They need to be removed immediately. Vanessa's response to my insistence on removing her unauthorized policies revealed the depth of her misunderstanding about her position and authority within the residential community. Rather than accepting my direction, she attempted to negotiate the terms of the policy implementation as if we were equals engaged in collaborative decision-making rather than a property manager addressing inappropriate actions by a temporary. I understand your concern about the implementation process, Vanessa said with the diplomatic tone of someone offering a reasonable compromise. Perhaps we should have consulted more extensively before posting the notice. However, the underlying issues that these policies address are real and important. Rather than simply removing them, we should work together to refine the guidelines and implement them through proper channels. The suggestion that we should collaborate on implementing her unauthorized policies demonstrated Vanessa's complete inability to understand that her actions were inappropriate regardless of her intentions or the perceived merits of her suggestion. Her use of the word "we" when discussing building management decisions revealed her assumption that she possessed legitimate authority to participate in policy development and implementation. When I explained that her policies would be removed immediately and that any future suggestions should be submitted through appropriate channels rather than implemented unilaterally, Vanessa's response escalated the confrontation to a new level of directness and inappropriate assertion of authority. I think you need to consider whether your current management approach is really serving the best interests of this community, Vanessa said with a tone that had shifted from diplomatic to challenge. The residents I have spoken with agree that improvements are needed, and many of them appreciate having someone take initiative to address problems that have been ignored for too long. The claim that residents supported her unauthorized policies was demonstrably false based on the concerned reactions I had received throughout the morning. But more troubling was Vanessa's apparent attempt to position herself as a legitimate alternative to my management authority. Her suggestion that my approach was inadequate and that residents preferred her leadership represented a direct challenge that demanded immediate and unequivocal response. The confrontation in the hallway had attracted the attention of several residents who observed the exchange with obvious concern about the escalating tension and confusion regarding building policies and management authority. The public nature of the disagreement added another layer of complexity to the situation, as residents needed clear information about who possessed legitimate authority to make decisions affecting their living environment.
I ended the hallway conversation by stating clearly that Vanessa's notices would be removed immediately, that her self-appointed title had no official recognition, and that any future policy suggestions should be submitted in writing for consideration through proper channels. I then returned to my apartment to address the concerns of the residents who were waiting for clarification about the confusing situation. The remainder of the day was spent in damage control efforts, contacting residents individually to explain that Vanessa's notices had been posted without authorization and that existing community guidelines remained in effect. The conversations revealed that Vanessa had been actively approaching residents throughout the previous week, presenting herself as someone with authority to make policy decisions and soliciting support for her suggested improvements. Several residents reported that Vanessa had introduced herself as Miguel's wife who was helping Elena with building management during a transitional period, a description that implied official status and authority that she did not possess. Others mentioned that she had asked detailed questions about their satisfaction with current policies and had suggested that changes were being considered to address various perceived problems. The systematic nature of Vanessa's outreach efforts, and her deliberate misrepresentation of her role within the building's management structure, revealed a level of calculation and presumption that exceeded anything I had anticipated when agreeing to accommodate her temporary residence. She had apparently been working for weeks to establish herself as a legitimate authority figure within the community while simultaneously undermining confidence in existing management approaches. Tuesday brought an escalation in Vanessa's assertions of authority that moved beyond policy announcements to direct intervention in resident conflicts and building operations. I discovered that she had taken it upon herself to mediate a minor disagreement between two residents about noise levels, presenting herself as an official representative of building management, and offering what she described as professional conflict resolution services. The residents involved in the original disagreement, Mr. Foster and Ms. Kim, had been working toward a mutually acceptable solution to their concerns about television volume during evening hours. Their discussions had been progressing successfully through the informal communication approach that typically resolved such issues within our community. Vanessa's intervention had complicated the situation by introducing formal procedures and documentation requirements that neither resident had requested or needed. She insisted on scheduling formal mediation sessions and creating written agreements about noise levels, Foster explained when he contacted me about the confusion. We were already working things out between ourselves, but she said that building management required official documentation for all noise-related issues. When we asked her about this policy, she showed us business cards identifying her as the interim community relations coordinator. The revelation that Vanessa had created professional business cards with an official-sounding title represented another escalation in her presumptuous behavior and her systematic effort to establish herself as a legitimate authority figure within the building. The business cards provided tangible evidence of her intention to assume a permanent management role rather than simply making temporary suggestions during her brief residence. Kim's account of Vanessa's intervention revealed additional concerning details about her approach to resident relations and her apparent belief that existing community dynamics required professional management oversight. Vanessa had suggested that the informal approach to resolving neighbor conflicts was inadequate for a quality residential environment, and that professional mediation services were necessary to maintain appropriate standards. She made it sound like our building was somehow substandard because we handle minor issues through friendly conversation rather than formal procedures. Ms. Kim reported. She kept emphasizing that professional residents expect more sophisticated conflict resolution processes, and that informal approaches create liability concerns for property management. The implication that Riverside Gardens was somehow deficient because it fostered a community atmosphere where residents addressed minor issues through direct communication rather than formal mediation represented a fundamental misunderstanding of the values and culture that made our community successful. More troubling was Vanessa's apparent attempt to create problems where none existed in order to justify her self-appointed role as a professional problem solver. Wednesday brought the most concerning development yet when I discovered that Vanessa had been conducting what she described as resident satisfaction surveys that included detailed questions about building management performance, maintenance response times, community amenities, and suggestions for improvements. The surveys were professionally designed and presented on the same letterhead she had used for her policy notices, creating the impression of official building management research. The survey questions revealed Vanessa's intention to gather evidence supporting her criticism of existing management approaches, while building a case for implementing the changes she had been advocating since her arrival. Questions were worded in ways that encouraged negative responses about current conditions, while prompting suggestions for improvements that aligned with Vanessa's previous recommendation. Examples of the survey questions included inquiries about whether residents felt that building management was sufficiently responsive to community needs, whether they believed that current policies adequately reflect professional standards, and whether they would support modernization efforts to bring building amenities up to contemporary expectations. Each question was designed to elicit responses that would support Vanessa's argument that significant changes were needed in building management and operation. The most troubling aspect of the surveys was their apparent purpose of establishing documentation that could be used to challenge my management authority or support claims that residents were dissatisfied with current conditions. The professional presentation and systematic approach suggested that Vanessa was building a case for some form of formal intervention or change in building management structure. When I confronted Vanessa about the unauthorized surveys, her response revealed the full extent of her presumptuous behavior and her apparent belief that she possessed legitimate authority to evaluate and potentially replace existing management arrangements. Rather than acknowledging that conducting surveys without authorization was inappropriate, Vanessa defended her actions as necessary research to support improvements in building operations. I am simply gathering data to support evidence-based decision-making about building management improvements, she explained with the confident tone of someone presenting a reasonable business proposal. Any professional management company would conduct regular satisfaction surveys to ensure that they are meeting resident needs effectively. The fact that this kind of systematic feedback collection has not been implemented previously suggests gaps in the current management approach. The implication that my management approach was unprofessional because it did not include formal survey research represented another direct challenge to my competence and authority. More concerning was Vanessa's apparent belief that she was qualified to evaluate building management performance and recommend changes based on her brief residence and her self-proclaimed expertise in professional standards. The confrontation about the surveys marked a turning point in my approach to managing Vanessa's increasingly inappropriate behavior. The diplomatic strategies I had employed thus far were clearly ineffective in establishing appropriate boundaries, and her escalating assertions of authority were creating genuine disruption within the residential community. The time had arrived for more direct intervention to protect both the community's harmony and my legitimate management authority. The foundation had been established for what was becoming an inevitable confrontation about authority, boundaries, and appropriate behavior within the residential community. Vanessa's systematic efforts to establish herself as a legitimate authority figure and her direct challenges to my management competence had created a situation that could no longer be addressed through patience and diplomatic deflection. The stage was set for the dramatic escalation that would ultimately reveal the true nature of our respective positions within the building's ownership and management structure. The 6th week of Miguel and Vanessa's residence at Riverside Gardens commenced with an atmosphere of growing tension that had become palpable throughout the building. The escalating conflicts over Vanessa's unauthorized policies and self-appointed authority had created an undercurrent of uncertainty among residents who were beginning to question the stability of their peaceful community environment. Several long-term tenants had approached me privately to express concerns about the changes in building dynamics and to seek reassurance about the continuation of established management practices. Monday morning brought in development that exceeded even my most pessimistic expectations regarding Vanessa's capacity for inappropriate behavior. I discovered that she had scheduled what she described as a mandatory building meeting for all residents, complete with professionally printed invitations distributed to every apartment unit. The invitations announced a comprehensive presentation about proposed improvements to building operations and community standards that would be held in the community room on Wednesday evening. The invitations were presented on formal letterhead that identified Vanessa as the interim director of community development and included language suggesting that attendance was required for all residents who wished to maintain their standing within the community. The authoritative tone and official presentation of the invitations created the impression that this meeting represented a legitimate building management initiative rather than the unauthorized actions of a temporary guest. The content of the invitation revealed the scope of Vanessa's planned presentation, which apparently included detailed proposals for restructuring building operations, implementing new fee structures for amenities and services, establishing performance standards for building maintenance, creating resident committees to oversee various aspects of community life, and introducing what she described as professional management protocols to replace existing informal arrangements. Each proposed change represented a fundamental alteration to the community culture and operational approach that had made Riverside Gardens successful for years. More concerning was the implication that these changes were being presented as inevitable improvements, rather than suggestions for consideration. The mandatory nature of the meeting and the authoritative presentation suggested that Vanessa believed she possessed the authority to implement these changes regardless of resident preferences or management approval. My immediate response was to contact residents individually to clarify that the meeting had been scheduled without authorization and that attendance was entirely voluntary. However, these conversations revealed that Vanessa had been conducting what amounted to a systematic campaign to build support for her proposed changes through individual meetings with residents that had been occurring throughout the previous week. Ms. Chan reported that Vanessa had visited her apartment to discuss what she described as exciting opportunities to modernize building operations and improve property values. According to Mrs. Chan's account, Vanessa had presented detailed financial projections showing how implementing her proposed changes would increase the building's market value and potentially provide residents with equity appreciation if the property were ever converted to condominium. She showed me charts and graphs that looked very professional, Mrs. Chen explained during our conversation. She said that buildings similar to ours in other neighborhoods had increased their values by 30 to 40% after implementing the kinds of improvements she is proposing. She made it sound like we would be foolish not to support these changes. Mr. Thompson's experience with Vanessa's individual outreach efforts revealed additional concerning details about her systematic approach to building support for her proposed change. Vanessa had apparently researched comparable properties in nearby neighborhoods and had prepared a comprehensive presentation about market trends and property values that supported her argument for implementing expensive upgrades and operational change. She spent over an hour in my apartment showing me pictures of other buildings that had undergone renovations similar to what she is proposing. Mr. Thompson reported. She had photographs of upgraded lobbies, modernized laundry facilities, and enhanced security systems that looked very impressive. She explained that these improvements would make our building more competitive in the rental market and would justify higher rents that would benefit everyone. The sophistication of Vanessa's outreach efforts and the professional quality of her supporting materials revealed a level of planning and preparation that exceeded anything I had anticipated when I agreed to accommodate her temporary residence. She had apparently been developing a comprehensive strategy for transforming Riverside Gardens, according to her vision, while systematically building resident support for changes that would fundamentally alter the character and affordability of the community. Tuesday brought an escalation that moved beyond building meetings and resident outreach to direct challenges to my management authority and decision-making autonomy. I discovered that Vanessa had been contacting local contractors and service providers to obtain estimates for implementing her proposed building improvements, presenting herself as an authorized representative of building management with authority to solicit bids for renovation projects. The revelation came when I received a phone call from Martinez Construction Company, a local contractor who had been hired for previous building maintenance projects. The contractor was calling to schedule a meeting to discuss what he described as the comprehensive renovation project that your building manager has been discussing with our estimating department. When I explained that no renovation projects had been authorized and that I was not aware of any discussions with their estimating department, the contractor expressed confusion and provided details about his conversations with Vanessa over the previous week. According to his account, Vanessa had contacted his company to request detailed estimates for lobby renovations, laundry facility upgrades, security system installations, and common area improvements that aligned precisely with the proposals she had been presenting to residents. The lady who contacted us seemed very knowledgeable about building operations and had specific requirements for all the work she wanted estimated, the contractor explained. She provided detailed measurements and specifications that suggested she had conducted professional assessments of the needed improvement. She said that building management was moving forward with a major modernization project and that we should prepare comprehensive proposals for presentation to the ownership group. The implication that Vanessa had been representing herself as an authorized building management representative to external contractors
represented a serious escalation in her inappropriate assertions of authority. More troubling was her apparent intention to present residents with specific cost estimates and implementation timelines that would make her proposed changes appear more concrete and achievable than abstract suggestions. Additional phone calls throughout Tuesday revealed that Vanessa had contacted multiple service providers, including security companies, internet infrastructure firms, landscape contractors, and equipment suppliers to obtain estimates for various aspects of her comprehensive improvement plan. Each contractor reported similar interactions where Vanessa had presented herself as someone with authority to make decisions about building improvements and had requested detailed proposals for immediate implementation. The systematic nature of Vanessa's contractor outreach and her consistent misrepresentation of her authority represented a level of deception and presumption that could no longer be addressed through diplomatic conversations or gentle correction. Her actions were creating potential legal and financial complications that threatened both the building's operations and my professional reputation as the legitimate property manager. Wednesday morning brought the final escalation when I discovered that Vanessa had posted an eviction notice on my apartment door. The notice, printed on official-looking letterhead and formatted to resemble legitimate legal documentation, informed me that my residence at Riverside Gardens was being terminated due to what it described as inadequate management performance and failure to implement necessary community improvement. The eviction notice specified that I had 30 days to vacate the premises and transfer building management responsibilities to what it described as qualified professional management personnel who possess the expertise necessary to modernize building operations and enhance property value. The notice was signed with Vanessa's full name and included the title Acting Property Management Director, along with language suggesting that the eviction was being implemented on behalf of building ownership. The audacity of attempting to evict me from my own apartment using fabricated authority and non-existent legal standing represented the ultimate expression of Vanessa's sense of entitlement and her complete disconnection from reality regarding her position within the building's ownership and management structure. The professional presentation of the eviction notice and the authoritative language suggested that she genuinely believed she possessed the legal authority to terminate my residence and assume control of building operations. My immediate response was to document the eviction notice thoroughly and contact residents to inform them that Vanessa's mandatory building meeting would not be taking place as scheduled. However, before I could complete these communications, I received a visit from Miss Patterson, who reported that Vanessa was in the community room preparing for her presentation and directing Miguel to arrange furniture and audio-visual equipment for what she anticipated would be a well-attended meeting. "She has been setting up for hours," Miss Patterson explained with obvious concern. "She has charts and displays arranged around the room and a stack of documents that she said contain contracts and agreements for residents to sign. She told Miguel that tonight's meeting would finalize the transition to professional management and that everyone would be excited about the improvements that are being implemented." The revelation that Vanessa had prepared contracts and agreements for residents to sign represented an escalation that moved beyond inappropriate assertions of authority to potentially fraudulent representation of legal authority she did not possess. The suggestion that residents would be signing documents during her presentation created serious concerns about the potential legal and financial implications of her action. I made the decision to confront Vanessa directly before her scheduled presentation could proceed, both to protect residents from potential fraud and to address the eviction notice that represented the ultimate expression of her presumptuous behavior. The time for diplomatic conversations and gentle corrections had clearly passed, and the situation required immediate and decisive intervention to prevent further damage to the community and potential legal complications. When I entered the community room, I found Vanessa arranging professional quality displays that included property value projections, renovation timelines, management transition schedules, and what appeared to be organizational charts showing new building management structure. The sophistication and comprehensiveness of her presentation materials revealed that she had been planning this meeting as the culmination of weeks of systematic preparation for assuming control of building operations. Vanessa, "This meeting is not authorized and will not be taking place," I announced with the firmness that the situation required. "You need to remove these materials immediately and cancel any arrangements you have made with residents regarding this presentation." Vanessa's response to my direct intervention revealed the full extent of her delusion regarding her authority and her complete inability to recognize the inappropriateness of her action. Rather than acknowledging her overreach or apologizing for the confusion she had created, Vanessa defended her actions with the confidence of someone who believed she was acting within her legitimate right. "Alina, I understand that change can be difficult, but these improvements are necessary for the long-term success of this property," she replied with the patient tone typically used when addressing unreasonable resistance to obvious progress. "The residents deserve professional management that can maximize their investment potential and provide the kind of amenities and services they expect in a quality residential environment." The implication that I was somehow preventing residents from receiving appropriate management services and that Vanessa's intervention was necessary to protect their interests represented the ultimate expression of her presumptuous worldview. Her apparent belief that she was acting as a champion for resident rights while I was obstructing progress revealed a complete inversion of reality that made rational discussion impossible. "You have no authority to schedule meetings, solicit contractor bids, conduct surveys, post eviction notices, or make any decisions regarding building operations," I continued with increasing direct. "You are a temporary guest who has systematically overstepped appropriate boundaries and created confusion and disruption throughout the community." Vanessa's response to my clear statement of the boundaries she had violated revealed that she had moved beyond simply misunderstanding her position to actively rejecting any limitations on her perceived authority. Her reply demonstrated that she viewed my management role as temporary and inadequate rather than legitimate and established. "I think you need to consider what is really best for this community," Vanessa said with a tone that had shifted from diplomatic to challenge. "The residents I have spoken with are excited about the improvements I am proposing, and many of them have expressed frustration with the current management approach. It is time for this building to have professional leadership that can take it to the next level." The suggestion that residents supported replacing me with Vanessa as building manager represented either deliberate misrepresentation of resident feedback or complete self-deception about the reception of her unauthorized activity. More concerning was her apparent belief that resident dissatisfaction with my management could somehow justify her assumption of authority she did not legally possess. The confrontation in the community room had attracted the attention of several residents, who observed the escalating tension with obvious concern about the implications for their living environment. The public nature of the disagreement required immediate resolution to prevent further confusion about building management authority and to protect the community from the disruption that Vanessa's actions were creating. The moment had arrived for the revelation that would fundamentally alter the dynamic between Vanessa and myself while demonstrating the consequences of presumptuous behavior and the importance of understanding one's actual position within established structures. The foundation had been established through weeks of escalating inappropriate behavior, and the ultimate confrontation could no longer be delayed or deflected through diplomatic approach. The confrontation in the community room had reached a critical juncture where further diplomatic discourse would serve no constructive purpose. Vanessa's systematic escalation of inappropriate behavior had culminated in an attempted eviction that represented not merely presumptuous overreach but a fundamental challenge to the legal and operational framework governing the property. The time had arrived for decisive action that would clarify the actual authority structure and resolve the confusion that had been allowed to develop over the preceding week. The residents who had gathered in the community room following reports of Vanessa's scheduled presentation observed the escalating tension with evident concern about the implications for their residential stability. Their presence created additional urgency for resolving the conflict definitively, as continued ambiguity about management authority would undermine the community cohesion that had been carefully cultivated over years of consistent, transparent leadership. Miguel had positioned himself near the audio-visual equipment that Vanessa had directed him to arrange, his discomfort with the escalating confrontation evident in his nervous fidgeting and avoidance of direct eye contact with either participant in the dispute. His passive observation of his wife's increasingly aggressive assertions of authority reflected the conflict avoidance strategy that had enabled Vanessa's behavior to escalate without meaningful intervention from the person best positioned to establish appropriate boundaries. Vanessa, I began with the measured tone that had characterized my professional communication throughout my career. Your actions over the past 6 weeks have demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of your position within this residential community. The time has come to clarify the actual legal and operational relationships that govern this property. I retrieved my briefcase from behind the reception desk where I had placed it upon entering the community room, understanding that the documentation within would provide irrefutable evidence to support the revelation that would fundamentally alter the dynamic of our confrontation. The weight of the leather case in my hands carried symbolic significance, representing years of careful planning, strategic investment, and disciplined execution that had enabled my transformation from tenant to property owner. The eviction notice you posted on my apartment door contains several factual errors that require immediate correction, I continued while extracting the relevant documents from my briefcase. Most significantly, you have attempted to evict someone who cannot be evicted from this property, under any circumstances, because they own the entire building and all the land upon which it sits. The initial response to my statement was complete silence as the assembled residents processed the implications of what they had just heard. Vanessa's confident expression began to shift toward confusion as the meaning of my words became clear, while Miguel's face reflected the dawning realization that his wife had been systematically challenging the authority of someone whose position was unassailable. I placed the property deed on the table that Vanessa had arranged for her presentation materials, the official document clearly identifying Elena Rodriguez as the sole owner of the Riverside Gardens property, including all buildings, common areas, and associated infrastructure. The legal description matched the address where we stood, and the recording date showed that I had held ownership for over 3 years. This deed establishes my ownership of the property where you have been residing as my guests for the past 6 weeks, I explained while allowing the residents to examine the document. Every policy you have attempted to implement, every contractor you have contacted, every survey you have conducted, and every authority you have claimed has been exercised on property that belongs entirely to me. Vanessa's reaction to the revelation progressed through several distinct phases, beginning with outright denial of the document's authenticity. She examined the deed closely, searching for evidence of forgery or fraud that would allow her to maintain her previous assumptions about the property's ownership structure. When the official seals and recording information confirmed the document's legitimacy, her response shifted toward attempting to minimize its significance.
"This must be some kind of mistake," she said with decreasing confidence. "Miguel told me that his sister worked as a property manager for the company that owns this building. He never mentioned anything about family ownership of the property." Miguel's uncomfortable silence confirmed that he had indeed provided Vanessa with incomplete information about my actual relationship to the property, though whether this represented deliberate deception or simple misunderstanding remained unclear. His obvious surprise at learning about my ownership suggested that I had maintained my privacy more successfully than I had realized, even within my immediate family. I retrieved additional documentation from my briefcase, including property tax records, insurance policies, and mortgage documents that provided comprehensive evidence of my ownership and financial responsibility for the property. Each document reinforced the legal reality that Vanessa had been attempting to exercise authority over property belonging to someone else while living there as a temporary guest. The property management company that employs me manages other properties in my investment portfolio, I explained to clarify the source of Miguel's confusion. I chose to manage Riverside Gardens directly rather than hiring external management services, which allows me to maintain closer relationships with residents and ensure that operations align with my values and standards. Ms. Jin was the first resident to speak following my revelation, her voice reflecting a mixture of surprise and understanding as pieces of previous interactions began to form a clearer picture. "This explains why you have always been so responsive to maintenance requests and so invested in maintaining the community atmosphere," she observed. "You were not just doing your job effectively, You were protecting your own investment and caring for your own property. Ms. Thompson nodded in agreement while examining the property documents. It also explains why you have been so patient with recent disruptions and challenges to your authority, he added. Someone in your position could have addressed these issues much more decisively if you had chosen to reveal your ownership earlier. The recognition from long-term residents that my patient approach to managing Vanessa's inappropriate behavior had reflected strength rather than weakness provided validation for the strategic decision to allow her actions to escalate before revealing the true power dynamic. Their understanding of the restraint required to maintain diplomatic relations while protecting community stability demonstrated the wisdom of the measured approach I had employed. Vanessa's response to the mounting evidence of my ownership reflected her struggle to reconcile this new information with the assumptions that had guided her behavior throughout the previous week. Rather than acknowledging her mistakes or apologizing for her presumptuous actions, she attempted to reframe the situation as a misunderstanding that could be resolved through continued collaboration. If you own the building, then you should be even more interested in implementing the improvements I have been proposing, she said with renewed confidence. These changes would increase your property value significantly and provide excellent return on investment. We should work together to modernize this place and bring it up to contemporary standards. The suggestion that I should implement expensive renovations based on Vanessa's preferences revealed her continued inability to understand that property ownership conferred decision-making authority rather than obligation to accommodate the suggestions of temporary guests. Her assumption that revealing my ownership would make me more receptive to her proposals demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of both property rights and appropriate boundaries. The property operates successfully under its current management approach and generates excellent returns through its established business model. I responded with the firmness that the situation required. The community culture and operational efficiency that you have been attempting to modify represent deliberate choices that align with my investment strategy and management philosophy. I retrieved the lease agreement that Miguel and Vanessa had signed for their downtown apartment, which I had obtained from public records to understand their financial situation more completely. The document revealed that they had committed to monthly rent payments that exceeded 40% of Miguel's documented income, creating the financial pressure that had necessitated their request for temporary housing. Your current financial obligations make it clear that implementing expensive building improvements would not benefit you personally, as increased property values would likely result in higher rent costs that would exceed your budget constraints, I explained while placing the lease agreement beside the property ownership documents. The affordable housing that Riverside Gardens provides serves residents who value quality and community over luxury amenities and status symbols. The revelation that I had access to their financial information and understood the economic pressures that had driven their housing situation added another layer of reality to Vanessa's dawning understanding of her actual position. The recognition that her attempts to transform an affordable housing community into a luxury property would ultimately price out residents like herself demonstrated the short-sightedness of her improvement proposal. Miguel finally broke his silence to address the revelation that had fundamentally altered his understanding of our family dynamics and his wife's recent behavior. "Alina, I had no idea that you owned this property," he said with obvious embarrassment. "When you agreed to let us stay here temporarily, I thought you were just being helpful with housing arrangements. I never imagined that you were actually providing us with free accommodation in your own building." The realization that their temporary housing arrangement represented significant generosity rather than simple family assistance appeared to affect Miguel more profoundly than his wife, whose focus remained primarily on the implications for her authority and status within the community. His growing awareness of Vanessa's inappropriate behavior towards someone who had been providing them with substantial financial assistance created visible tension in their relationship dynamic. Vanessa's response to Miguel's acknowledgement of my generosity revealed her continued struggle to accept the fundamental shift in power dynamics that my ownership revelation had created. Rather than expressing gratitude for the housing assistance or apologizing for her presumptuous behavior, she attempted to maintain her position by questioning the wisdom of my management approach. "Even if you do own this building, I still think you are missing opportunities to maximize its potential," she insisted with diminishing conviction. "The improvements I have been proposing would benefit everyone, including you as the owner. Just because you have legal authority does not mean that you are making the best business decisions. The suggestion that my successful management of a profitable property investment somehow required guidance from someone with no relevant experience or financial stake in the outcome demonstrates Vanessa's remarkable persistence in maintaining her sense of superiority despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Her inability to recognize the inappropriate nature of her continued criticism revealed character traits that extended far beyond simple misunderstanding. I gathered the documentation that had established my ownership and returned it to my briefcase. The symbolic action representing the conclusion of the revelation phase of our confrontation. The legal reality had been established beyond dispute, and the time had arrived to address the practical implications of Vanessa's systematic overreach and inappropriate assertions of authority. The eviction notice you posted represents an attempt to exercise legal authority that you do not possess over property that you do not own, I stated with the clarity that would be required for any subsequent legal proceeding. The policies you implemented, the contractors you contacted, the surveys you conducted, and the meetings you scheduled all constitute unauthorized actions that have created confusion and disruption within the residential community. The comprehensive nature of Vanessa's inappropriate activities and the systematic approach she had employed created potential legal implications that extended beyond simple boundary violation. Her misrepresentation of authority to external contractors and her attempts to collect resident information through unauthorized surveys represented actions that could have serious consequences in professional property management context. Vanessa's final attempt to maintain her position involved appealing to Miguel for support in what she characterized as an unfair attack on her well-intentioned efforts to improve their temporary living situation. "Miguel, you need to explain to your sister that I was only trying to help," she said with increasing desperation. "Everything I did was intended to benefit the community and improve conditions for everyone living here." Miguel's response reflected his growing understanding of the serious nature of his wife's actions and their potential consequences for both their temporary housing arrangement and their family relationship. "Vanessa, you cannot try to evict someone from their own property," he said with unprecedented directness. "Elena has been incredibly generous in allowing us to stay here, and your behavior has been completely inappropriate." The support from Miguel represented a significant shift in the family dynamics that had enabled Vanessa's escalating inappropriate behavior. His recognition that her actions were indefensible regardless of her stated intentions provided additional validation for the decisive approach that the situation required. The assembled residents observed this family confrontation with obvious discomfort, but their presence served an important purpose in establishing community awareness of the resolution that had been achieved. Their understanding that normal operations would continue under established management would help restore the stability and confidence that Vanessa's actions had undermined. The moment of truth had been delivered with the documentation and clarity required to resolve all ambiguity about authority and appropriate relationships within the residential community. The revelation of ownership had fundamentally altered the power dynamic, while providing context that explained both my previous patience and the decisive action that would now be required to protect the community's stability and success. The immediate aftermath of revealing my ownership of Riverside Gardens created a profound silence that seemed to suspend the normal operations of the community. The weight of the revelation settled over the assembled residents like a heavy blanket, transforming their understanding of recent events, while forcing them to reinterpret weeks of escalating conflicts through an entirely different lens. The documentation spread across the presentation table served as irrefutable evidence of a reality that none of them had anticipated when they gathered to address concerns about building management and community standards. Vanessa stood motionless beside her carefully arranged presentation materials, her expression reflecting the psychological process of reconciling contradictory information with previously held assumptions. The professional displays that had represented her comprehensive plan for assuming control of building operations now appeared as monuments to presumption and misguided ambition. Her confident demeanor had been replaced by visible confusion as she struggled to process the implications of having spent 6 weeks attempting to exercise authority over property owned by the person she had been systematically undermining. The cognitive dissonance created by learning that her temporary housing arrangement, represented extraordinary generosity rather than simple family assistance, required fundamental reconstruction of her understanding of both her position within the community and her relationship with me. Carefully constructed narrative she had developed about my inadequate management performance and her necessary intervention to protect resident interests had been shattered by the revelation that I possessed absolute authority over every aspect of the property she had been attempting to control. Miguel's reaction to the ownership revelation reflected a different kind of processing, as he grappled with the realization that his wife had been systematically disrespecting someone who had been providing them with substantial financial assistance. His understanding of family dynamics and obligations had been fundamentally altered by learning that our temporary housing arrangement represented significant generosity rather than simple accommodation. The embarrassment visible in his expressions suggested growing awareness of the serious nature of Vanessa's actions and their potential consequences for both their housing situation and their family relationships. Mrs. Chen was the first resident to break the silence that had followed my revelation, her voice reflecting the thoughtful consideration that had characterized her interactions throughout her 8 years of residence at Riverside Garden. "Elena, this explains so much about your dedication to maintaining our community and your patience with recent disruptions," she observed. "We have always appreciated your responsiveness and care, but understanding that you own the property helps us recognize the personal investment you have in our satisfaction and well-being." Her comment provided validation for the management approach I had developed over 3 years of property ownership, confirming that my commitment to maintaining high standards while preserving affordability had been recognized and valued by the residents I serve. The understanding that my patient response to Vanessa's inappropriate behavior had reflected strength rather than weakness created a context for interpreting recent events that supported the strategic approach I had employed. Ms. Thompson nodded in agreement while examining the property documents that remained spread across the table. "It also explains why you have been so committed to preserving the community atmosphere and maintaining policies that support long-term residents," he added. "Someone in your position could have implemented changes that would increase revenue at the expense of resident satisfaction, but you have consistently prioritized our needs and preferences." The recognition from long-term residents that my ownership had been exercised responsibly and in their best interests provided powerful validation for the business model I had developed. Their acknowledgement that I had chosen to maintain affordable housing rather than maximizing profits through expensive upgrades demonstrated that my approach had achieved the balance between financial success and community service that I had intended when purchasing the property. Vanessa's response to the supportive comments from residents reflected her continued struggle to accept the fundamental shift in power dynamics that my ownership revelation had created. Rather than acknowledging her mistakes or expressing gratitude for the housing assistance she had received, she attempted to maintain her position by questioning the timing and necessity of the revelation. "Why did you not tell us about your ownership from the beginning?" she asked with a tone that suggested I had somehow been deceptive by maintaining privacy about my financial affairs. "If we had known that you owned the building, we would have approached the situation differently and avoided the misunderstandings that have occurred." The implication that I bore responsibility for the misunderstandings created by her presumptuous behavior demonstrated her continued inability to accept accountability for her actions. Her suggestion that knowledge of my ownership would have prevented her inappropriate assertions of authority revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of appropriate boundaries that extended beyond simple ignorance about property relationships. Property ownership is not information that landlords are required to share with tenants or guests, I responded with the measured tone that had characterized my professional communication throughout the escalating conflict. The appropriate approach to temporary housing arrangements is to respect existing management structures and community standards regardless of ownership detail. I retrieved the unauthorized policies that Vanessa had posted throughout the building, along with her fabricated eviction notice and the business cards she had created with fictional management title. The collection of documents represented a comprehensive record of her systematic attempts to exercise authority she did not possess over property she did not own. The evidence demonstrated that her actions had extended far beyond simple misunderstandings to deliberate misrepresentation of her position within the building's management structure. These materials document a pattern of behavior that would be inappropriate regardless of ownership structure.
I continued while displaying the evidence for the assembled resident. Posting unauthorized policies, scheduling mandatory meetings, contacting contractors without authorization, conducting surveys without permission, and attempting to evict residents represent serious violations of appropriate conduct in any residential community. The documentation created a visual representation of the systematic nature of Vanessa's inappropriate behavior, helping residents understand that recent disruptions had resulted from deliberate actions rather than innocent misunderstanding. The professional presentation of her unauthorized materials demonstrated that her behavior had been calculated and persistent rather than impulsive or accidental. Rodriguez, who had been observing the proceedings from near the community room entrance, stepped forward to contribute her perspective on the situation. "I want to thank you for handling this situation with such patience and professionalism," she said while addressing me directly. "Many property owners would have responded much more harshly to this kind of disruption, but you allowed the situation to develop fully before taking decisive action." Her observation provided additional validation for the strategic approach I had employed in managing the escalating conflict. The recognition that my patient response had reflected strength rather than weakness helped establish context for understanding why I had chosen to reveal my ownership at this particular moment rather than earlier in the conflict. The supportive comments from multiple residents created a powerful contrast with Vanessa's defensive responses, highlighting the difference between their appreciation for respectful treatment and her expectation of special accommodation. Their understanding that my measured approach had protected the community while addressing serious disruptions demonstrated the wisdom of allowing situations to develop fully before implementing decisive intervention. Vanessa's reaction to the positive feedback from residents reflected her growing isolation as her attempts to build support for her proposals and criticisms of my management were contradicted by the actual experiences of long-term community members. Rather than accepting the evidence that her assessment of building operations had been incorrect, she attempted to dismiss resident satisfaction as evidence of low standards rather than effective management. Just because people are satisfied with basic services does not mean that improvements are not needed, she insisted with decreasing conviction. Professional property management requires continuous evaluation and enhancement of operations to maintain competitiveness and maximize value creation. The suggestion that resident satisfaction indicated inadequate management rather than successful service delivery revealed the fundamental disconnect between Vanessa's approach to property management and the community-centered philosophy that had made Riverside Gardens successful. Her inability to recognize that happy residents represented the primary objective of residential property management demonstrated a misunderstanding of basic business principles that extended beyond simple boundary violation. Miguel's growing discomfort with his wife's continued defensive responses became increasingly apparent as the community room discussion progressed. His recognition that her behavior had been inappropriate regardless of her stated intentions created visible tension in their relationship dynamic that had been largely absent during the preceding weeks of escalating conflict. "Vanessa, you need to understand that what you have been doing is not acceptable," he said with unprecedented directness. "Elena has been incredibly generous in allowing us to stay here, and your response has been to criticize her management and try to take over her property. This is not a misunderstanding, this is seriously inappropriate behavior." The support from Miguel represented a significant shift in the family dynamics that had enabled Vanessa's escalating inappropriate behavior. His willingness to directly challenge her actions rather than avoiding confrontation demonstrated growing awareness of the serious nature of the situation and the need for accountability rather than continued accommodation. Vanessa's response to Miguel's criticism revealed the depth of her commitment to maintaining her position despite overwhelming evidence of its inappropriateness. Rather than accepting responsibility for her actions or expressing gratitude for the housing assistance she had received, she attempted to recruit Miguel as an ally in her continued resistance to accepting the changed power dynamic. "Miguel, you know that I was only trying to help improve our living situation and create a better environment for everyone," she said with increasing desperation. The suggestions I made were based on professional experience and genuine concern for community welfare. I cannot understand why everyone is treating my efforts to contribute positively as some kind of attack. The characterization of her systematic attempts to assume control of building operations as helpful contributions demonstrated her continued inability to recognize the fundamental inappropriateness of her behavior. Her appeal to Miguel for support in maintaining her position revealed expectation that family loyalty should override objective assessment of her actions and their consequence. Miguel's response to Vanessa's appeal reflected his growing understanding of the serious nature of her behavior and the need for accountability rather than continued enablement. Vanessa, you cannot try to evict someone from their own property and then claim that you were just trying to help, he said with a firmness that had been absent from his previous responses to her behavior. Your actions have been completely inappropriate, and you need to acknowledge that rather than continuing to defend them. The direct challenge from Miguel represented a crucial turning point in the family dynamics that had allowed Vanessa's behavior to escalate without meaningful intervention. His recognition that her actions were indefensible regardless of her stated intentions provided additional validation for the decisive approach that the situation required. The assembled residents observed this family confrontation with obvious discomfort, but their presence served an important purpose in establishing community awareness of the resolution that had been achieved. Their understanding that normal operations would continue under established management would help restore the stability and confidence that Vanessa's actions had undermined over the preceding weeks. Miss Tatterson, who had been quietly observing the proceedings, contributed her perspective on the situation with characteristic diplomatic insight. I think we all appreciate Elena's patience in allowing this situation to develop fully before taking decisive action, she observed. The clear evidence of inappropriate behavior makes it possible for the community to understand what happened and move forward with confidence in our management structure. Her comment provided additional validation for the strategic approach I had employed in managing the escalating conflict. The recognition that allowing the situation to develop fully had created clear evidence of inappropriate behavior helped establish context for understanding the necessity of the decisive intervention that had been required. The supportive responses from multiple residents created a powerful contrast with Vanessa's defensive reactions, highlighting the difference between their appreciation for respectful treatment and her expectation of special accommodation. Their understanding that my measured approach had protected the community while addressing serious disruptions demonstrated the wisdom of strategic patience combined with decisive action when intervention became necessary. As the community room discussion progressed, it became clear that the revelation of my ownership had fundamentally altered not only the power dynamic between Vanessa and myself, but also the broader understanding of recent events within the residential community. The residents who had been confused by conflicting information about building policies and management authority now possessed clear context for interpreting the disruptions they had experienced. The transformation in community understanding created an opportunity to address the practical implications of Vanessa's inappropriate behavior, while establishing clear expectations for future interaction. The documentation of her systematic overreach would serve as evidence for any necessary legal proceedings, while providing context for decisions about the continuation of her temporary housing arrangement. The moment had arrived to transition from revelation and discussion to practical resolution of the conflicts that had developed over the preceding weeks. The truth had been established with irrefutable documentation. Community understanding had been achieved through transparent community, and the foundation had been created for implementing whatever consequences would be necessary to protect the community's stability and ensure appropriate respect for legitimate authority. The transition from revelation to practical resolution required careful consideration of multiple factors that would influence both the immediate stability of the residential community and the long-term implications for family relationships. The documentation of Vanessa's systematic inappropriate behavior provided clear evidence for whatever decisions would be necessary, but the complexity of the situation demanded strategic thinking that balanced accountability with proportionate consequence. The assembled residents remained in the community room as I gathered the unauthorized materials that Vanessa had distributed throughout the building over the preceding weeks. The collection of fabricated policies, fictional business cards, unauthorized surveys, and the attempted eviction notice created a comprehensive record of behavior that extended far beyond simple misunderstandings or cultural differences. The systematic nature of her actions and the deliberate misrepresentation of authority they represented required decisive response to protect both community's stability and my legitimate management authority. Vanessa's continued presence in the community room reflected her apparent belief that the ownership revelation somehow created opportunities for negotiation or compromise regarding the consequences of her actions. Her body language suggested expectation that family relationships and her stated good intentions would mitigate accountability for behavior that would be unacceptable from any resident or guest regardless of their personal connections to building management. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.